You are listening to Single Serves. My name is Arno Marture and I am your host. Single Serves is a podcast dealing with design, architecture, business, and city building in which I interview an expert on a specific subject matter. Together, we dive into that topic and challenge conventional thinking in a thought-provoking conversation. I sincerely hope that you will find these conversations as engaging as I did and learn a thing or two in the process. Don't forget to send us your comments, criticism, and praise. To do so, you can email us at hello@rvltr.studio or leave a comment online. You can also subscribe to the podcast on our website at rvltr.studio. Daniel Ling is an architect, director, and principal at Montgomery Sisam in Toronto. While involved in a wide range of work from education to healthcare to various forms of housing, he more recently designed housing for the homeless through the use of modular construction. This is what we're going to talk about today. So, Daniel, thank you very much for being on the show. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting.
So, can you start by telling us who you are, what you do in your own words, in 3 sentences or less?
Sure, absolutely. So, to say I'm an architect, and together with my partners, we're really interested in working to build a practice that has a strong culture and to really do work that combines design quality with strong social value. So in other words, designing building that addresses social issues.
That sounds great. So as I mentioned earlier, you're here to talk about supportive housing projects. Can you tell us what they are more specifically, in more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a series of them. So, I mean, in essence, they are permanent housing for those that are experiencing homelessness. Right? So these projects for us really started in early 2020 with the beginning of the pandemic. The first series of projects are for the City of Toronto, what we call Phase 1. There were 2 projects, and the initiative was to provide 100 homes over 2 sites. So these 2 are constructed already, one at 11 Macy Avenue and one at Dover Court. So these are delivered through modular construction because of the speed of it, because there's a need to provide them through rapid delivery. Really at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a overcapacity with the shelter system. There's a need to find homes for these individuals very quickly. So the City of Toronto employed this method to deliver these 2. So they are self-sufficient, small compact studio units, about 300 square feet. It has a kitchen, washroom, shower, everything that is in a home, but in a very compact, efficient fashion. And so the reason for modular is that because of because of the speed of it. So from the beginning, when we were hired in May 2020 to when the first unit was moved in, it was 8 months. So the first occupants moved in before Christmas.
That's rather impressive. So is that a new thing that the city is doing, or they have been building housing for the homeless before, but the kind of newness of it was building modular? There has been housing for the homeless. There's also been various shelter facilities, but the modular construction component is relatively new. It was initially used in BC a few years ago, and then more recently here in Ontario. And so are you able to tell us a little more about where this type of housing fits in? Because I'm assuming the city has many solutions to deal with homelessness and things like that. Like, can you give us an overview of what the ecosystem is like for as far as the city is concerned?
I can give a bit of an overview. I mean, there's obviously the shelter system, which is temporary. Mm-hmm. There is something that's more transitional, where it's really a temporary housing. It's permanent housing, but it's intended to transition them out of the system. And then there's these housing, which is permanent housing, where they're intended to stay there for as long as they need.
So in the case of these, do they become basically tenants of the city and they just stay as long as they need and then move on to other things later on?
Yeah, the way these works is that the city would collaborate with a nonprofit. So the nonprofit organization would actually operate and run the facility, right? And depending on the particular organization, they might offer different services, or they might have different policies.
Gotcha. So why did you get involved with housing for the homeless?
Well, I guess there's two main reasons I could say. One I touched on earlier is that we're a practice that are interested in design work that has meaning, that has offers social value. And I think, the people that tend to work here with us are interested in doing design, but design that can make a difference. And what we realize that as a practice, even though that's sort of the culture and the interest, it also makes sense as a business model when you focus on work that have relevant issues that the community or society is facing at the moment. Mm-hmm. The government tend to be in the same place. Funding tends to be coming at the same time. We tend to stay nimble to the issues that are at play. So that's one reason. The second reason is, as a design challenge, is interesting for us. How do you work with projects that has certain constraints, and how do you find opportunities out of that? How do we use modular construction that has a certain perception of being perhaps institutional, and turn it into something that fits into various contexts, into various neighborhoods? How do we do housing in a economical way? The idea of doing more with less. How do we work with such tight schedule? What does that mean from a design perspective? And so for us, it's interesting to create architecture that has within such constraints.
So what would be some of the lessons you learned from that? Like, you've talked about some of the challenges you were facing and constraints. What would be the most important lessons you've drawn from it that you might be able to apply to future work? There's a lot of lessons. Modular construction and prefabrication is pretty interesting. There's the whole pros and cons of, quality control. What can be done in the shop could be extremely high quality because you're doing it in a controlled environment versus what happens on a site. So we take a lot of time thinking about how to design these, so that how do we maximize the sort of type of work that could be done in the shop and minimize the type of work that's done on site. There's sort of other technical challenges. We won't get into the details how, these things come completely finished and it gets craned into place. So there's the idea of, tolerance, and, how do they actually join together is interesting from a technical perspective. I guess the other aspect is, because these are wood modular system, there's a certain limitation. They tend to be 3 to 5 story, so it generates relatively compact buildings. So from a density and built form perspective, it's also interesting for us. The sites are relatively compact, 100 by 200 feet. So within sort of what would fit 5 to 6 single family houses, we would fit 50 units. In terms of how it applies to other projects, I think that the speed of these are good lessons learned. We're involved in other affordable housing projects, such as the Housing Initiative, the Housing Now Initiative you might have heard of, where the city wants to deliver over 5,000 affordable units over the next few years, and these tend to be much larger, mixed use developments, and as quickly as the city is intended to do them, it still takes a few years, right? So to be able to deliver something that could be within 12 months, I think it's something that is relevant to other housing projects, and just the speed of providing housing. So I have kind of a twofold question for you. Maybe you can break it down into separate answers if you want. But the first part of the question is, modular construction has been very much liked by architects by and large for the last few decades, maybe the last 50, 60 or 70 years, but it's never really taken hold as a very common way of building. It happens and people build in modular construction, but
by and large, most construction is still based on the on-site construction model. Why is that not more common, given the fact that, it's faster, more precise, better finished? There's plenty of advantages to modular construction and few constraints. I mean, you have size constraints maybe, but architects are also really good at working with constraints. So why isn't that more prevalent as a technique or method of construction? And how does the advantages or the lessons you've learned from modular housing for the homeless possibly apply to the broader housing challenges? Because as we both know, currently housing affordability is an issue for everyone, not just for low-income people. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think, to answer the first part of the question, why is it not used more frequently? Why hasn't it taken hold as much as one could imagine? I mean, I think there is a cost premium to modular construction. So I think it really comes down to, is there a business case for it? Right. So let's say you're applying to market housing, for example, and there is maybe $50 or $75 a square foot premium on the modular versus conventional. Does the speed of accelerating the construction, the benefit of that, is that greater than the cost premium? So it really comes down to the business model. So that's one. I think the other is that modular construction makes sense when you have a lot of repetition, right? So does the program take benefit from this construction? The projects that I'm talking about, the first one was 100 homes over 2 sites. The second phase of the Toronto project is 300 home over 5 sites. Mm-hmm. These are all identical units, all 300 square feet of the same thing. So it makes a lot of practical sense. When you get into other building types, even regular market housing, there's a lot more variety. So at some point you lose the economy of that repetition. In terms of lessons apply to other housing projects, I think that's your second part of your question.
Yeah.
I could see. I could see highly sustainable, perhaps micro homes that provide compact living that might work for other housing, like market housing. These are what's interesting about these. These are wood frame construction, so not using steel or concrete, other than a bit of foundation. So they're fairly sustainable projects. And because of the constraint of the module, which has to be about 12 to 14 feet wide by 65 feet long, so it fits in sort of a truck. It tend to work for the smaller units. So that's one application that I could see, and because of the size of it, it might pay for the premium. By building less per unit, it might start to make financial sense for the premium of the of modular.
Yeah, those are very interesting points, because and this is a bit of my personal opinion, but you'd think that now that we've seen how bad the housing affordability has become of an issue, you'd think that all the traditional solutions that we've traditionally relied on should be not discarded, because they probably have some value, but should be considered somewhat obsolete and looking at maybe faster and easier ways to build. So you'd think people would be trying a bunch of new things, such as modular housing, and I'm sure there's other technologies out there that could help with the problem. So it's an interesting answer that you've given me. Would you see, for example, rental housing be reasonably based on the same model, or is that just so completely different that it wouldn't work for that?
I think it's possible. I think it really, again, I think it comes down to the business case. How much are you able to charge for it, relative to the premium? So that's why I think, the idea, I think as the trend goes towards more sustainable living with a smaller footprint, maybe the sort of willingness to live in less space, it might start to swing it so that it makes sense from a business perspective to use this. The other thing that's interesting is, unlike, when developer build out of concrete, for example, which is the majority of the housing development, there's a certain economy to going high, right, with the tower footprint.
Well, they kind of have to make their pro forma work, right?
Right, exactly.
The zoning and the development charges are so restrictive that they have to go as high as they can to maximize their revenue or profit.
Exactly. So you don't see a lot of 3, 4, 5-story, concrete condos around. For this particular type of construction, it's wood frame modular, and the limitation is really around 5-story. You can maybe stretch it to 6 at the most. So a lot of the buildings we're doing are sort of the type of infill urban project that is the kind of density that we're missing a lot in Canadian cities. The one that we're doing now for Housing City Hamilton is 24 units on a lot that's only 100 foot wide, 3-story. And it would normally fit 2 or 3 houses at the most, and we're fitting 24 homes in that in 3 stories. And so they actually fit well into the residential neighborhood while adding the type of density that we need.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of precedent even in Toronto. The units are bigger, obviously, but you have a lot of those 3-4-story apartment buildings that are not much taller, if at all, than the surrounding houses, but have a slightly bigger footprint, and they usually have a flat roof, so you can have large units on 2 or 3 floors and have 6 homes on what would be a one large home on the same lot. So that makes a lot of sense. So you wanted to add something?
Yeah, and I mean these particular sort of models that we're looking at for affordable housing, they don't have parking, so there's no underground parking, there's no basement. Because of the number of units, there isn't a large garbage sort of loading requirement. So it's actually a relatively light footprint on these tight urban lots. So that's, I think, something we can learn from.
And could you realistically, in modular, build larger units, maybe combining several modules together? Could you have a 800 to 1,000 square foot apartment?
Yeah, sure. You certainly can. You could put 2 modules side by side, and that would create a 1 or 2 bedroom units. That is probably in the range of 750 to 800 square foot. Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but I'd love to hear your opinion on that. And just out of curiosity, what do you think are the biggest roadblocks to the current housing affordability issues that we have? And if you had a magic wand, what would be your solution or solutions to that?
Well, I think the part of the roadblock is, City of Toronto is very unique, right? Where we still have a lot of single family housing in the downtown core.
Yeah.
So and there is quite a bit of resistance in certain areas to densify those areas. So, you tend to have a kind of this all or nothing approach, where the developer goes in, goes for the OMB and goes for the full blown podium, 40-story tower solution. And so, so if we have the magic wand, would be to look at innovative way to introduce these smaller scale housing unit, into the residential neighborhood and create a wider variety of housing, and to offer and maybe offer these smaller unit options that are quite sustainable, where you don't have to, let's not build more than we have to, but fit it into the residential neighborhood. And I think what we've learned also through this process, and because some of the municipality we've been working have been quite pushing the sustainability agenda quite a bit, is that these type of building can be done with a very low carbon footprint. These are not glass condos, glass housing buildings. They're highly
insulated envelope. We have triple glazed window in them. Because they're sharp fabricated, you can take advantage of that quality and have really tight envelope with very low air infiltration. So, one of them we're doing is going to be Passive House certified. We are looking at a net zero prototype for these for this building type now. Next, this is something that's in on the drawing board. So I think we can easily do zero emission buildings housing in an affordable way out of this type of construction.
Yeah, let's hope the regulatory environment becomes more favorable to that, because I personally think a large part of the blame, not all the blame, but a large part of the blame is on politicians' lack of balls, for lack of a better term, to change the zoning and allow not crazy dense, but denser typologies as of right, instead of having, 60 or 70% of the city that's entirely zoned for single family, which is insane. I mean, I moved to Toronto 17 years ago, and even then we didn't have those problems, but it was insane to me that a city the size of Toronto, as you mentioned earlier, would have entire neighborhoods of single family homes in the downtown core. Like, that just never made sense to me, because I grew up in cities where, the downtown core was a much denser area. You'd have like 6 to 10 story buildings everywhere and walkable neighborhoods and all the amenities within 15 minutes, which is pretty much the case in most of downtown-ish Toronto neighborhoods. But as soon as you get a little further out, it's a lot less livable if you don't have a car. So those are very interesting kind of legacies we're left to deal with from a much different era. I think those were all the questions I had for you, because all the other questions I didn't ask you pretty much answered in an indirect way. Are there any last words you want to share with the podcast audience, or any ideas you want to put out there?
Yeah, sure. I've been thinking a lot about this, because this is something these rapid delivery housing projects is something that we've only been exposed to in the last 24 months. And we've gone through 9, we're on the 9th project now. So it's been very exciting. So thinking about all that, I mean, one thing that I came across a quote recently, I don't know if you heard it by Ray and Charles Eames, and they wanted to do the best for the most for the least. So the best design for the most people for the least cost. And I think that's quite inspiring when we are thinking about the housing crisis and affordable housing. How can we apply this sort of vision to creating highly sustainable, compact, affordable living?
Yeah, well, hopefully your work kind of paves the way for other people to follow suit and maybe use modular housing and prefabricated in a factory and to solve some of those challenges. But regarding that quote from the Eames, I didn't know that quote, but I'm not surprised knowing their work. It's very much in keeping with their lifelong work ethic. So I'm glad you shared that. I want to thank you very much for your time. I think it was a very interesting conversation, and hopefully the first of many.
Thanks, Arno. Thanks again.
Hey, Arno here. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and that you'll come back for more. Please share with your friends and colleagues, and remember to subscribe on our website at rvltr.studio. Until next time, ciao.